Okay, so up to Poetic Phenomenological Meditation number 64, the ongoing documentation of the writing that I did 10 years ago and which ultimately produced the book Being and Learning. And I want to note before I get going that this day started off in a very positive way, or at least in a very positive, energetic way, because I received the first ever comment from someone on one of my videos. So this person, and it's on YouTube, and her name is Yolanda Gallo, and she wrote, "I have read the preview of your book by Sense, and it is deep, beautiful, and inspiring. Thank you." So that was kind of cool. I really appreciated that. And of course, when you see that hundreds of thousands of people, or even thousands of people, or even hundreds of people have been looking at videos on all sorts of stuff, but some of it related to um, the questions that I'm exploring, you can allow yourself to start to, well, no one's interested. But it doesn't, as long as you get one sincere note like that, as far as I'm concerned, um, that's not what I'm intending for, but it sort of is a recognition. And the other thing is, given that this is the Christian Holy Week, I would note, and I'm in no way comparing myself to him, but Jesus of Nazareth, he started off with just 12 disciples, right? He had only a small number of people. So if we're comparing, and the masses were sort of, not interested. And that's, of course, a matter of debate. I mean, but he certainly, he was welcomed on last Sunday, Palm Sunday, by throngs of people and all that. But the point is that he had a core of small group of people. And I find inspiration in that. I'm in no way being delusional and comparing myself to Jesus. The point rather is that in terms of, the working group of a quintet or a quartet or even a power trio, is really what it's about. So you may have no one who actually is commenting or viewing what you're doing, but in fact, it's all about the work. And so that's the story I'm telling myself, and I'm going to stick with it. All right, so up to number 64, that was written this day, April the 17th, 2004, and I'm going to read it this day, April 17th, 2014. And I did take a look, just because I was curious where I was, and this material from 417 is pages 100 and 101, and we are just about at the very end of this fourth chapter. It's sort of interesting that the fourth chapter on the Plato's allegory of the cave returns to the cave at the end and focuses on it. And so the focus on the truth of concealment is quite interesting, that it concludes with that. So without further ado, and the last sentence from yesterday's meditation was, "The truth of concealment is thus identified in the conservation of freedom." The end of education, or schooling, is depicted in the second part of the story. This end begins with the important originary turning, the releasement of the prisoner from his chains. Socrates describes this releasement as the, quote, "healing of their unwisdom," or as the beginning of their being, quote, "cured of their lack of insight," unquote. The second part is the crucial transition from schooling to learning, from the unilateral to the dialogic. The one-sidedness of the bondage has restrained the prisoner, who is wholly lacking in experience and thus devoid of any authentic perspective. The second part of the story is the most transitional of all transitions that define this tale of liberation of learning, because it describes the moment where the twofold play begins to shift from the one-sidedness of concealment. The moment of setting free and the sudden standing up represents the first in a series of painful pangs. The pangs are the essence of the painful and arduous emergence of freedom. They are the birth pangs of natality. The transitionality of this moment is important. Indeed, for Heidegger, it is essential, for it reveals transformation and transition as the fundamental motif, and hence the truth of education, paideia, as a purposeful wandering, here understood as an ongoing rehabituation or, quote, passages from one dwelling place to another, unquote. The essence of the second part of the story is the disorientation that follows from being unchained and forced to stand up. This is the child emerging from childhood, the disorienting transition from the security and innocence, the confusion issued from the initial encounter with one's place within the world itself. The initial transition from schooling to learning, depicted here in part 2, is originary, or the most original experience of disorientation. As original, this experience is unmatched in the disorientation it produces. Here, we depart from Arendt, who reads the third and final turning, the returning up to the cave, and his companions, as quote, the worst of all loss of orientation, unquote. While there is an important link between the first and third turning, between the initial unchaining and the return to the cave, especially when we understand both as moments of profound disillusionment, the initial shock and pang experienced is unmatched. The experience, whether or not is recalled through memory, will from this moment onward enable learning to unfold from the reception of evocative sayings. This originary moment of releasement and disorientation is, in fact, the first offering, the first evocative saying. This first saying is offered by the stranger who has arrived unannounced to release the chains and command the captive to stand up. If learning is put underway through an evocative saying that evokes wonder, this saying is received as evocative because it is heard as strange and unusual. To be capable of hearing a saying in this way, one must have been prepared. The reception of the evocative saying is prepared by this original moment of disorientation, the initial turning, the transition from schooling. It is this event, the most disorienting experience. It is the most disorienting experience in the entire process. The initial evocation, calling, occurs when the captive is, quote, set free and forced to suddenly stand up, turn his head, and walk with eyes lifted to the light. All these movements would be painful, and he would be too dazzled to make out the objects whose shadows he had been used to see, unquote. It's from the allegory. The originary turning, periagoge, appears as the most significant disorientation, because the captive is thrust out of the only location he has ever known. He has completely lost his bearing when he receives the news that what he has taken to be the one and only world is in fact only a semblance, a mere show or complex illusion. Socrates asks us to consider how the unchained captive would react when he received the news about the concealment, the news that is offered as the originary evocative saying. Quote, what do you think he would say if someone told him that what he had formerly seen was meaningless illusion? Suppose further that he were shown the various objects being carried by and were made to say, in reply to questions, what each of them was, unquote. It is at this moment, when asked to describe the illusion that is being revealed, to account for unconcealment itself that is appearing from its hiding, that we identify the profundity of the transformation, the confusion that is uniquely identified at this point in the story. Nowhere else do we find Socrates speak of perplexity. Socrates supposes that he would be at a loss for words. Indeed, because he has no words to describe what he sees. He has no perspective, no bearing, no orientation. Quote, would he not be perplexed and believe the objects now shown to him to be not so real as what he formerly saw? Unquote. The perplexity revealed in the lack of words and the desire to return to the comfort of bondage exemplifies the transitionality that is persisting in the midst of the always already not yet. Between the two moments of the twofold play, there exists a gap, a more original abyss. A more original abyss than the no-thing that is depicted in the non-perspective of the captives who are held back and from whom the world is hidden. This gap is the space through which the transition is made, which enables for the reciprocal exchange, the dialogic. Without this gap, difference would be negated and being would be reduced to the static one. This gap conserves and protects the possibility of learning as a relational event, but for learning to get underway and continue, the learner must pass through this space of profound ambivalence, and that's where it ends. This is a very difficult meditation, and I have a lot going on right now in terms of knowing that I'm coming to a conclusion of chapter 4. I'm tempted against my own style, the whole purpose of this project, to use logic in a way. That is to say, logic, obviously, I'm following it in some respects, and there's its own kind of logic. But I mean to say that just consistency, and not so much logic. Especially at the end, where I say, this is the kind of move that I make all the time, which is to sort of use this material, this story from Plato, to make a point, an ontological point. That is to say, talking about the allegory, but really I'm talking about, I'm trying to make a philosophical statement, right, about the way things exist, right? So it's a jumping off point. Plato's story is just a text, not just a text, but it's a text that I'm using to reflect on the human condition, specifically as a way of talking about learning from an ontological point of view. So what I do here, though, is I talk about this moment, right, this moment of releasement as being unlike any other. And that's pretty consistent. I've been doing that for a while. That is to say that even in what I'm working on now, to say that there's this sort of originary moment, but that originary moment is sustained, right? So we can go into or experience that. In fact, we always are. And part of the work is to recollect it. And so that ontological difference between beings and being, for example, if not being the example. But so I say that, between the two moments of the always, already, and not yet, right? So the actually existing potentiality of the human being, right? So the offering of freedom, right? So that's the always, already, but the not yet is its actualization or enactment, right? So freedom is there, offered to us. It's in potency, and it waits for freedom. And so we have to take it up and do something with it. And it's the doing something that's not yet. So in the moment in which it's being offered, being disclosed to us, freedom is in potentiality, and so we have to take it up, and that's what learning becomes, right? So that the difference is between the offering that arrives to us and what we do with it, enacting it, which is learning. So there's always an ontological difference between being, which is the offering, and learning, which is the enactment. However, I say that between the two moments, so the twofold play between being and learning, there persists a gap. That's the ontological difference. What I call a more original abyss. And then I go on to say, this gap is the space through which the transition is made, which enables for the reciprocal exchange, the dialogic. Okay. The offering happens over the gap. But then I say, without this gap, right, difference would be negated, being would be reduced to a static one, so. But this is here. For learning to get underway and continue, the learner must pass through this space of profound ambivalence. So that's where, I'm wondering, and I'm pretty much wrapping up this discussion of the allegory of the cave. To move through. Right, so this is then the threshold that I talk about more recently in my work. Right, so to go through the threshold. Now, my question is, for myself, as I speak into this camera on my computer, is if that gap between being and learning is persisting, and if I'm insisting on it, as it has to be there in order for there to be the offering of freedom and the enactment of freedom in the form of learning. So being as the offering and learning as the enactment. What does it mean to pass through this gap? What does it mean to for learning to get underway and continue, the learner must pass through? So to say that this gap is this space of profound ambivalence is a bit of a confusion, I think, because the gap is like a time space. It's a topo. It's, to use the Greek, and I'll continue to use the Greek. It's a no. I'm not simply going to use the Greek. Now, let me give you, anyone who's watching this, some context. So I feel like it's very interesting, because in the time that I've been reading these meditations on the allegory of the cave, I feel like I myself have had something similar to chains being broken. And if I can say this, I will. The shadows that I have been looking at have been the shadows offered by the philosophy that I've been studying for the last, 30 years. Right, so I started studying philosophy in 1984, so this is one of those, 4 is for me it's an important year. Numbers that 6 is the other one. I was born in 66. Anyway, and so I went to, and 8 is another one, because that's when I went to graduate school. But my formal study of philosophy started in 1984. It started in high school, actually, in spring semester in my English class with Ron Kaplow, great teacher at Summit High School. And then at Fordham. And for the most part, the Greek, ancient Greek philosophy and ancient, Greek and then, or early or late ancient Greek philosophy in the Roman times, Plotinus, and early medieval. I mean, I'll always have a place in my heart for that stuff. In part because it comes from, another time, the ancient time. And it's a stretch to just, draw a straight line from Athens to Berlin or London or Paris or something like that. That's just a ridiculous leap. And anybody who tries to do that knows it. In part because, the way that the Greek philosophy was retained through Northern Africa. So I don't want to take all that up. My only point is that in my own education and my own field of study, I've just been going full on with, Greek philosophy for the most part, but then, the way that it gets picked up and taken over by philosophers in the 19th and 20th century, and now the 21st, but, mostly the people that I focused on are 19th and 20th century German philosophers. Nietzsche, Hegel, Heidegger, and then Arendt, who's sort of German-American. Which has been wonderful. And I have been educated, by them. But the point is that the education that I've received from them has been one-sided. That's been the truth of concealment, right? And what's been concealed to me is kind of like myself as a person of another world in another time, as someone who is of this hemisphere. And I mean not just because the Western Hemisphere includes Iberia and most of the island where England is and Western Africa, right? I mean the Americas. You know, so as a product of the Americas, right? Insofar as, you know, my family comes from the Dominican Republic and I was born here in the United States, that whole side of me is what's been sort of concealed in this context of philosophy. In fact, unproblematically, I remember encountering a discussion with my colleague at Loyola Marymount, this guy Mark Morelli, who pretty much dismissed out of hand anything that didn't come from the West. It wasn't philosophy. So, you know, that was just matter of fact. I was so young when he said that. I was, you know, and that was an interesting time in my life too, to be at Loyola Marymount and to be sort of already moving towards a desire to get outside, but not being able to do that. I'm still staying in the cave, and that being through my dissertation. So, you know, my dissertation, I wrote it into the philosophy of education. That was kind of, I stood at the threshold of philosophy of education, and with the articulation of an ontology that I called, I didn't call it, I appropriated the notion of the ontology of the mestizo, the existential situation of the mestizo. That was the real breakthrough. And then I came up with a pedagogy called mestizo multiculturalism. But I didn't really do anything with it. Or if I did it in a way that I wasn't really conscious of. So now, all these years later, I find myself developing, really now, moving through the threshold and saying, okay, enough with dwelling with my teachers from Germany and from Athens, beloved as they are to me, and they've given me all these resources. Now it's time to move on and to explore what is really of this side of the Atlantic, this side of the Pacific, right? And the resources that are there. So I just wanted to make that note, you know, for myself when I watch these videos, if I ever do again, or for anyone who's watching, that in the time that I've been doing these meditations for the last, you know, month, at least since Albuquerque, for sure. It started in Albuquerque and sort of culminated at UPenn. You know, I feel I moved out into, or rather, I'm moving out of the cave. Let's put it that way. I know that sounds like somewhat dramatic and, you know, exaggerate. It might sound like an exaggeration, but it's true. The work I'm doing now is, for the first time, really developing a vocabulary. And how did I started to say something before, which is to talk about this time in between, and that's what got me going on it. And so I was going to use the ancient Greek word topos, and I said, no, I'm not going to do that, because I'm going to use a word that is a word that I've just started to use, which is the Incan or Andean ontological word, umapacha, the original time and place. So this space in between is at umapacha. And you can move into it. In fact, I'm suggesting we're sort of in it, but you can't move through it or cross over it. At least you can in this lifetime, I would argue. I mean, there would be two possibilities that I'm really not interested in at this point. One of them is death. Not interested in death at this moment, thank you very much. And the second would be the ecstatic, the mystical. I had deep interest in that when I was an undergraduate and somewhat when I was a graduate student. But that ecstatic transcendence beyond is it's not that it's not interesting to me, it's just not part of the work I'm doing right now. The work, as I've mentioned before, is very terrestrial. So there you have it. I'm a couple pages away from completing chapter 4, and that's where I'm going to leave this. Really, for the first time in a couple of days, a real true commemoration and documentation. So that's it.